We take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. In a few minutes, we'll get into a variety of other issues, but I thought we would focus our time and attention, at least in this first segment or so, on the Supreme Court decisions that have come down. This is the last week of the Supreme Court, and this is when many of these very important decisions are dropped. Oftentimes, they tend to drop on Thursday and Friday. We've already had a couple drop earlier. Of course, the most significant one for us in terms of religious liberty was the Masterpiece Cake case having to do with Jack Phillips. But two today that we've talked about on the program have actually been rendered. And the first one has to do with the so-called travel ban. And we'll get into more of that in just a minute. And then also one called NIFLA, which has to do with the pregnancy centers in California and the what I thought was kind of draconian language that was actually used to require all sorts of things, which I think at their face should have been declared unconstitutional. As we go through here, you're going to wonder if I actually believe we lost these cases, because I'm going to be fairly critical. And the reason for it is that in both of these cases, they were 5-4 decisions. Now, I recognize that all of us bring a little bit of a bias to the legal discussion, but I would say that if you were just to look at this with any level of objectivity, these both could have been 9-0 decisions. One that says, does the president, according to Article 6 of the Constitution, have the authority to determine what kind of immigration procedures his administration will implement? Is it possible that the president could ever have a ban on individuals, countries, whatever? And the answer to that is yes. Very clear that Article that power in the hands of the president. And of course, if you say, well, I would disagree with the policy that the president has implemented, you have the recourse, obviously, through the legislative branch. But when you just pick one judge, originally in the state of Hawaii, to say this is unconstitutional and thus prevent the actions from taking place, that just seems inappropriate. When you look at the kinds of requirements that were placed upon the pro-life pregnancy centers in California, again, you'd have to say that unless you just had a real bias towards abortion in general, you'd have to say that if these kinds of requirements were put in any other establishment other than a pregnancy center, you would declare those unconstitutional because they involve compelled speech. We'll get into that in just a minute. And so even though I will agree that both of these decisions have come down in what I think is healthy in terms of, one, the immigration policy and protecting us from terrorists, and number two, who have pro-life convictions to be able to do so without having to alert other people to the fact that there are abortion clinics down the street, then you can see that I agree. And to recognize that almost anybody, whatever your persuasion might be, if you could look at it with just a little bit of objectivity, probably would conclude that it shouldn't have just been a 5-4 decision. But the 5-4 decision, I think, illustrates something very important. Elections have consequences. Would a President Hillary Clinton appointee in the court these two decisions, and I think we pretty much know the answer, if for the fact that, once again, we have the 4 guaranteed. There was a study done a number of years ago, and I can't wait for the new updated numbers to come in, but what they found is these 4 individuals vote in lockstep all the time. There is rarely, if ever, a significant case. There's only one case, I think, where even Justice Breyer voted away from the liberals, but that was not necessarily. You almost know that when you bring your oral arguments before the Supreme Court, you already know how those 4 justices are going to vote before you even open your mouth. And this is the case here once again. Those 4 justices in lockstep decided that the travel ban was unconstitutional. These 4 justices had no problem at all with a pro-life pregnancy center being required to promote abortion clinics within their particular venue. And it just illustrates again why you really have to pay attention to this, because if it weren't for Neil Gorsuch, these 5-4 decisions to it. The 5-4 decision is an attempt to say that what eventually was the travel ban, and I think you could call it travel ban 3.0, because the president put out a travel ban, some of it was declared unconstitutional, puts out a second one, and then comes up with a third one. And the majority opinion written by Chief Justice John Roberts, who wrote that the order was squarely within the scope of presidential authority under federal law. He went on to say that the sole prerequisite set forth in federal law is that the president find that the entry of the coveted and detrimental to the interests of the United States. The president has undoubtedly fulfilled that requirement here. Now, the dissent comes, as you might imagine, Justice Sonia Sotomayor, who was appointed by President Barack Obama, said, this repackaging does little to cleanse the policy of the appearance of discrimination that the president's words have created. Based on the evidence in the record, a reasonable observer would conclude that the proclamation was motivated by anti-Muslim animus. Before, even when it was used by Justice Kennedy, who in many places is seen as a conservative or a moderate. In this case, it's used by Sonia Sotomayor and by those who the dissent. And my argument has always been, forget about motive when you talk about the constitutional issues. Yes, motive is important in a criminal justice case. I understand that. Was this premeditated or was it manslaughter? So what was the motive? What was the intent? Obviously, that's important in a criminal justice case. But when you're talking about a policy, I don't care if it's motivated by bad faith. If it's a good policy, it's a good policy. And I don't care if people have a really good motive and implement a bad policy, it's still a bad policy. And more importantly, I don't care if they have the worst motives, and I don't believe the president does, but let's concede the argument, even if the president just hates people that are Muslims. No evidence of that, but that's what is basically said right here. Then that's reason enough to declare a policy which I think other presidents could have come up with easily is not unconstitutional. Because, again, if this is anti-Muslim, you got a real problem. According to Justice Samuel Alito, we have about 50 different Muslim-majority countries. The so-called travel ban affected how many? Not even 10%. The basic number is 8%. So, again, you are talking about a very small percentage of the population of these Muslim-majority countries. And, again, when you look at the 8% of the Muslim population, that's really significant when you realize that the country that has the most number of Muslims is Indonesia. Was there a travel ban from Indonesia? No. Another country with an enormous number of Muslims, because it's a country with a very large population, India. Was there a ban on Muslims from India? No. Well, then why not for those countries? Because there aren't Muslims coming from Indonesia or India that want to kill us. But some of these other countries, maybe so. I have a lot more to say, but we have one of those mandatory breaks. 2 decisions coming down from the Supreme Court, both 5-4. We'll talk more about it right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Earlier this month, I talked about how many liberal progressives complained that Alan Dershowitz had changed. Actually, they are the ones who have changed. And in a recent op-ed, Dershowitz explains how the ACLU has abandoned its original mission. He should know since he served on the national board in the early years of his career. He writes that the director of the American Civil Liberties Union has now acknowledged what should have been obvious to everyone over the past several years. The ACLU is no longer a neutral defender of everyone's civil liberties. I'm not sure how neutral the ACLU has been in the past, but I'll concede the point to him. He says that they used a key test back in those days, which he called the shoe on the other foot test. In other words, would you vote the same way if the shoe were on the other foot? He concludes that now the ACLU wears only one shoe, and it is on the left foot. Its color is blue. The organization now seems only interested in taking cases and supporting policies that promote progressive ideas in the Democratic Party. Some of us can remember when the ACLU would occasionally take a very controversial high-profile case in which they would defend the rights of neo-Nazis or Klan members to march. An article in the New Yorker says the ACLU is getting involved in elections and reinventing itself for the Trump era. Not only is it getting involved in election campaigns, but it also plans to spend $25 million on races and ballot initiatives. This is quite a change for a group that used to be called nonpartisan. Frankly, the ACLU has been a left-leaning organization since its founding, but at least it tried to occasionally play both sides of the civil liberties question. That is no longer the case. It is now injecting itself and its ideologies in American politics. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
All right, once again, let me talk just another minute or two about the travel ban. We'll get on to the next issue. Again, a 5-4 decision where the critics called it discriminatory. But again, if it is, I think the burden of proof was on them. When you only have 5 countries that were on the banned list out of 50 Muslim-majority countries, and when you look at the number that were banned, it's 10% of the countries, but only about 8% of the entire Muslim population. How do you make that a Muslim argument unless you just simply don't like the president? And think about the logical implications of this. If it had gone the other way, and again, a 5-4 decision in the future could go the other way. We have an election coming up here, and if Democrats take over the control of the Senate, it is quite possible that if there is another vacancy in the Supreme Court, Donald Trump will have to put forward somebody that is more like the individuals that Barack Obama has put on the court. And so the 5-4 decision could go the other way. But just think about maybe you have a breakdown in the whole vetting process, which was the argument being made by Donald Trump. Maybe you have a situation in which there are individuals that have actually infiltrated into this, and we find out that they have been allowing individuals in this country that do intend us harm. Would it not be possible for the president to say, we just need to take a pause here and not bring anybody else into the country for the moment, not try to vet anyone else until we can root out the problems in this system? Or if we eventually have a country that is even more hostile towards us than right now, wouldn't it not be possible that the president could say, given the animus and the anger and the hatred of individuals in this country towards the United States, it is better not to allow them in? And whether that comes from a President Hillary Clinton or a President Donald Trump, or in the past a President George W. Bush or President Barack Obama, does that not make sense? But more importantly, even if you dislike the policy, and I'll be the first to say I wasn't real thrilled about that. Just imagine if in one of those 5 countries you've been counterterrorism agent for the United States, and because it's gotten so hostile there, you need to break cover and come to this country. But because you're from that country, you're not allowed. So in some respects, this was a policy done with a meat cleaver rather than with a scalpel. So I'm not totally thrilled about the policy in the first place. But even if you don't like the policy, and even if you think it was motivated by Muslim hatred, which it obviously was not, you still have to come down to a very obvious conclusion. The Article 2 of the Constitution provides for the president to actually deal with this in his administration and deal with the borders. And so the fact that you could not even get in these dissenting opinions an agreement that we just don't always like the president, but after all, some presidents should have the authority to do that. You couldn't even get that far because I think there is such almost a Trump derangement syndrome, even in the court right now, that you can't even see something that is obviously very clear, and that is, like the policy or not, the president has that policy, the president has that authority, and to say in a 5-4 decision that he barely has that policy, of course, is not something that makes me feel very comfortable. Let's get to the next 5-4 decision, and this one I thought was also very clear because the California legislature passed what was called the Freedom, Accountability, Comprehensive Care, and Transparency Act, and of course they call it the FACT Act, and it passed back in 2015. It requires these pro-life pregnancy centers to post a disclosure that you can receive abortions essentially down the street. More importantly, those it not only said you had to post those, but they must be at least 8.5 inches by 11 inches, written in no less than 22-point type, and many of them, especially if there was a place where there were multiple languages, had to be in multiple languages. So basically what it said is that even though you are pro-life, even though you are anti-abortion, even though you are trying to save babies, even though you are trying to provide to women an alternative to abortion, when they walk in, the first sign they probably will see is a sign mandated by the legislature saying that there's a way which you can get abortions down the street. And it just, is hard to imagine. You would never say to a Chevy dealer that you have to post a sign saying that the Ford dealership is down the street. You would never have an individual that maybe would be required if you went into a vitamin store to be required to say that we have questions about how effective these vitamins are. So if you really want to get good health advice, you need to go to these doctors. I mean, just think about all the possible ways in which you would just roll your eyes and say, there is no way you would do this. And yet, interestingly enough, not only did this pass the California Assembly and the California Senate, and then it was signed by the governor, but then the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals rejected the arguments used by the National Institute of Family and Life Advocates, which is why it's called NIFLA. And there are about 135 pregnancy resource centers in California that are these pro-life centers. It actually rejected both of those arguments and argued that the state could regulate, and they had to create a new category. They called it professional free speech, because there's no way in the court records that you can come up with this kind of thing. So they called it professional free speech, and that it protected public health interest. And so as a result, you had this case making its way to the Supreme Court. And again, to the credit of the court, they were willing to take the case, and the majority opinion rendered by Clarence Thomas. But let me refer to the concurrence which came from Justice Anthony Kennedy, because, again, he focused not just on the fact that this was such a draconian law, but it also was done with what we oftentimes refer to as viewpoint discrimination. Tomorrow we'll have our roundtable discussion, and Nick Pitts will be here, Chelsea Yeoman. I know Chelsea's really going to want to get into this, but let me again quote from Justice Kennedy. He says it does appear that viewpoint discrimination is inherent in the design and the structure of this act. This law is a paradigmatic example of the serious threat presented when government seeks to impose its own message in the place of individual speech, thought, and expression. For here, the state requires primarily pro-life pregnancy centers to promote the state's own preferred message of advertising abortions. This compels individuals to contradict their most deeply held beliefs grounded in basic philosophical, ethical, or religious precepts, or all of these. And I do love what Neil Gorsuch asked during the oral arguments, and that is, doesn't the state of California have the ability to promote abortion? Why are you requiring pregnancy centers? Why are you requiring at least these 130 remote something? Don't you have any other kind of means or mechanism by which to promote them? And of course, the answer to that is yes. Now, what's so interesting is when you start looking at this, you also see the implication of pregnancy centers, but interestingly enough for the church, which again is the National Institute of Family and Life Advocates, talked about the fact that this law was an attempt to mandate that pro-life centers are advertising for abortion. Of course, he said it was scandalous, but he pointed out something that I had missed before, and that is, given the fact that this ruling came in the Ninth Circuit Court, it, of course, means that not only is it legal and constitutional at the moment in California, but anywhere else in the Ninth Circuit Court, and one example of that would be Hawaii. I was just on a Hawaii radio program just the other day, and he said that in Hawaii, at least one of the pregnancy resource centers is actually located in the church. So again, the argument is by winning in California, it also protected the church, because sometimes these pregnancy centers are in a different location. I go to Prestonwood Baptist Church, and I know that their particular center is not located in the church building, but I do know, as I've traveled to Florida and other places to speak at pregnancy centers, that some of them are. And so you can see that would affect these centers, but also could even affect the church. And at that point, you begin to see again that this should have been a 9-0 slam dunk. Both of these should have been, but instead, both of them are 5-4. Let's celebrate the victory for liberty. Let's celebrate a president, whoever that president may be, not just this president, but future presidents, to understand the importance of being able to control our borders. But let's also recognize how tenuous both of these are. When we come back, I want to get to one of the articles I've posted here by David French called The Days of Rage, and also play some videos that go along with this particular article. One in which you can hear Maxine Waters' call for attacks on the Trump administration. And then, if we have some time, I'd like to also play the piece by Pam Bondi, an individual that is the Attorney General in the state of Florida. But as I've mentioned yesterday, if you have not taken the time to support this ministry, we're at the end of our fiscal year, and we need to hear from you. Visit the website, pointofview.net. We'll be back with more right after this.
The young man burst into tears. He was in obvious distress, but thankfully, Don Blythe had the exact answers he needed. God took a chance encounter in a restaurant bathroom of all places and turned it into a divine appointment that forever impacted a young couple and saved the life of their unborn child. Don was able to help because he was prepared. And where does Don Blythe get some of the information and resources he needs to be ready for the next opportunity? He listens to Point of View. He listens because others like you took action. This is your opportunity to help equip people to be ready. And because of a special matching challenge, your gift here in June will have double the impact. You can be part of some amazing transformations, and it all starts with a simple phone call, 1-800-347-5151, or by clicking into pointofview.net. One day, you are going to make a difference. That future is now. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, talked about the two Supreme Court decisions, one having to do with the travel ban, the other with the pro-life pregnancy centers. And I thought for just a minute we might hear from Jim McKee. He is one of those individuals that actually started the pregnancy center in Dallas many years ago, and of course was very influenced by Point of View. As I've mentioned before, and let me mention it all through the week, that this is the last week before the end of our fiscal year. So we are dependent upon your financial gifts to keep this ministry going. And if you would like to join with us, and I hope that you would, and appreciate some of the conversation that we have here, some of the information that we have, we encourage you to visit the website, pointofview.net, or you can give us a call on our pledge line, which is 800-347-5151. But seeing this victory today for pro-life pregnancy centers around the country, especially what happened in California, brings me back to an individual, Jim McKee, who started the pregnancy center here in Dallas. And part of the reason he did so was because he listened to Point of View.
What Marlon Maddox did at that point in time really provided that there again, the framework of the example of what could take place when we got that message out, and what could take place when the average individual in the pew stepped forward and used their God-given gifts and talents, as the Good Samaritan did, just to help somebody else in need. And so there was a transformation that really did take place from just being upset about a problem to actively doing something tangible and real about solving the problem. So he was that mouthpiece, if you will, that clarion voice that there was hope, that really gave us the framework and the foundation that is still being felt today. He very much demonstrated that we not only should have a gospel-centered approach to our lives, but making sure that we were actually demonstrating that level of hope in real and tangible ways. And he was on the cutting vanguard, the cutting edge, the vanguard of that process taking place. And out of that knowledge and understanding, we brought a model in from Mississippi called Save a Life. And at that point in time, we began the process of putting the ministry together. And eventually, it at that time was called Crisis Pregnancy Centers of Dallas, in which we were providing real help to families and to women who are facing problem pregnancies as an alternative to abortion.
You know, one of the things I've had a chance to do over the years is travel to various venues, various locales, and speak for these pregnancy center banquets. And the one in Fort Worth, of course, this one in Dallas, and many others were started in large part because they heard us talking about this on Point of View. So it's just a good illustration of when you give to Point of View, you are making possible some of these very significant outreaches. The most recent statistics I've looked at suggest that we may have 3 times as many pregnancy centers in America as we have abortion centers in America. And a lot of that is due to the pro-life emphasis, certainly in our churches, certainly in Christian organizations, but I think also on this radio program. So let me encourage you to do what you can to help us out. 1-800-347-5151 or pointofview.net. First article I've posted here today is by our friend David French called Days of Rage, and in which he says, you know, American politics is taking a dangerous turn, or I should say American politics is taking a dangerous turn again. And he talks about some of the things I mentioned yesterday, leftist protesters targeting Stephen Miller, an aide to Donald Trump, taunted the Secretary of Homeland Security, Kirstjen Nielsen, in a restaurant in her home, mocked and allegedly spat on, and we'll hear more about that in just a minute, the Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi in a movie theater, and denied service to a Trump press secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, in a restaurant in Lexington, Virginia. if you don't think this is heating up, this article here even more disturbing, because you might say, well, if they're a cabinet officer, they deserve it. How about the people that work for Homeland Security, and they may or may not have voted for Donald Trump. They may not even like him, but they work there. Well, here is one of a decapitated and burned animal carcass, which was put on the front porch of a Department of Homeland Security officials. You have all sorts of incidents that are taking place in which you are starting to see more and more people that are just part of the issue of Homeland Security, DHS, immediately being confronted, actually intimidated in the rest. And a lot of this comes from a call that came from Democratic Congresswoman Maxine Waters. And so I could try to read it, but I thought since the video is linked to this particular article we've posted, here's actually what Maxine Waters said at that particular rally.
We want it done now. We're going to insist on it. If you think we're rallying now, you ain't seen nothing yet. Already, you have members of your cabinet that are being booed out of restaurants, who have protesters taking up at their house, who's saying no peace, no sleep. No peace, no sleep. And guess what? We're going to win this battle, because while you try and quote the Bible, Jeff Sessions and others, you really don't know the Bible. God is on our side. On the side of the children. On the side of what's right. On the side of what's honorable. On the side of understanding that if we can't protect the children, we can't protect anybody. And so, let's stay the course. Let's make sure we show up wherever we have to show up. And if you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd. And you push back on them. And you tell them they're not welcome anymore, anywhere.
And again, you see, again, restaurant, department store, gasoline station, and of course, some of them are finding out they're, again, a burned and decapitated carcass on your front porch, all sorts of noises and videos being played, and on and on. And what David French says is, make no mistake, this is provocative rhetoric. Angry, in-your-face confrontations dramatically increase the chances of violence. Put people in close proximity, yelling and spitting, and public officials will rightly start to fear that they're in physical danger. And he says, while millions of Americans don't remember that a Bernie Sanders supporter last year tried to assassinate a significant portion of the Republican Congress, that was at the ball field there, you can be rest assured that not a single Republican in Washington has forgotten. And so the argument, he says, comes back is, well, desperate times call for desperate measures. This is an evil president. This is an evil set of policies. And he says, well, what's the limiting principle here? First of all, the president, he says, caved on family separation after a few days of intense bipartisan public pressure. Now the immigration policy the protesters are targeting is similar to one that the Obama administration applied until late in his presidency. How, for that matter, does the desperate times call for desperate measures apply to, for example, the FCC chairman, Anjit Pai, which I talked about yesterday over this issue of net neutrality, or he talks about Charles Murray, where he was not hurt but could have been, and the woman who was with him, who actually didn't necessarily agree with him at all, actually was a liberal progressive, was hurt and spent time in the hospital. And then he uses an example from Wisconsin of where you had some home invaders, which were actually what? They were law enforcement, but it was, as he said, a obscene abuse of power. And so this is why David French, I think, wisely said, it's precisely because politics is important that we have to work so hard to maintain peaceful and reasonable discourse. If history is any guide, the default human position is the scream of rage followed by the lunge for the pitchfork. We human beings have a tendency to escalate politics into civil strife and civil strife into war. And, of course, you've had more and more people saying, are we headed for a civil war? So we'll see where that goes. And when we come back, wanted to tell the other story, and that is Florida, who is not a Trump cabinet member, but it doesn't matter anymore. And it gets me back to what Jim Garrity is saying, has Maxine Waters figured out what this means? because, as he says here, does she think this tactic will be used only by leftist protesters, only against Trump cabinet officers, and that in no circumstance will pushing back at them lead to violence against those targeted individuals? Does she think that there's no possible scenario where the security details assigned to protect cabinet officers from harm respond to threatening behavior with force? Does she think that there's a scenario where the cabinet officers, the president, and supporters in general decide that because so many leftists are angry, they'd better change their minds and policies? These are really good questions. And now when the Trump administration announced I guess it was just yesterday, but earlier this week, I guess is the best way to say it, when they suggested that maybe some of these cabinet officers might want to get their concealed carry license. How long is it going to be before violence breaks out in the streets? And so when we come back, we'll talk about these angry mobs and just give you one example, and that is that Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, went to see the documentary on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, but apparently she's not welcome in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. A recent article out of Canada reports that ethicists are recommending that conscience laws be modified for the medical profession. The argument suggests that physicians should not have the right to opt out of providing such services as prescribing contraceptives when a patient requests such services. According to the authors, quote, doctors must put patients' interest ahead of their own integrity. If this leads to feelings of guilt or remorse or them dropping out of the profession, so be it, unquote. That is truly shocking language that we should take note of, especially since, as the article in the National Post points out, every country in the civilized world recognizes at least some form of conscientious objection. Not only do the authors suggest that certain professions should be closed to those whose integrity would require the abandonment of the conscience to practice it, it fails to understand what conscience actually is. The reason we provide protections for the exercise of conscience is because people should not be made by the government to make their conscience optional. As Dr. Robert George of Princeton University has put it, quote, the right of conscience is a right to do what one judges oneself to be under an obligation to do, unquote. We will see whether Canada takes up the proposal by its professors, but south of the border, we must be vigilant that we never permit the government to make optional what our Creator has made obligatory. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me again go back to this piece that we have posted. But before we do, let me just mention that oftentimes we have individuals that not only watch our program or listen to our program online, but also in our own culture. When you have a congresswoman advocating hostile actions towards the members of the political party you don't agree with, it incredibly is over the top, and I would agree. And especially when we now start seeing, as Jim Garrity warned in his column earlier, that do you really think, Maxine Waters, this is only going to be focusing on the Trump cabinet officers? What about the rank and file that work in the Department of Homeland Security, or work in the Department of Health and Human Services, or work in immigration? And by the way, some of those individuals, these border agents, saying they're actually suffering as well. Of course, one, he broke a leg or a ham, something like that. I can't remember all the details. But just to help you understand that this is getting broader than that, let's, if we can, now go to an interview that was done at Fox and Friends. This is a link that is found in the article that we posted, so you can watch it in its entirety and see her reactions as we're going to just be playing the audio. But again, she is the Attorney General in the state of Florida, a little bit further removed from what is happening at the border of Texas and Mexico, or Arizona and Mexico, to put it mildly. But nevertheless, it doesn't take much for people to be set off. And so here is the interview that was done with the Attorney General of the state of Florida, Pam Bondi.
We were at a movie, my boyfriend and I were in line to get tickets, and it's Mr. Rogers. The irony of that is
a documentary about his life.
About his life, and about how he's anti-bullying and kindness and respect each other's views. And a woman approaches me in the ticket line and starts screaming that I was personally ripping babies out of the arms of mothers. And they were videoing me, and I said, I'm glad you're videoing this, because I've never agreed with separating the mothers and the babies. And I said, Congress has to act on this matter. And they said, no, it's you. These babies are being kept. And then, because I was talking normally to them, they didn't know what to do. So then 3 huge guys came up and started probably an inch from my face, screaming at me every word in the book, cursing as loud as they could. So then my trooper came up, and my boyfriend and I got our tickets, we're headed in, and then they ran in and circled me where I could not get into the theater. They stopped me. So he came up then and stopped them. So then we went in the theater, thought it was diffused. We're up getting popcorn at the concession stand, and they came up again, just every curse word in the book. And they said to him, hey, Blue Eyes, come on, aren't you going to protect her? Using a lot of a lot of other words too. Aren't you going to protect her? What are you going to do? What are you going to do? And they're this far from my face. One spit on my head. Now, I can't say that was intentional because he was yelling so loud. I don't know if it was just him spewing out of his mouth. But
how did you restrain yourself? Because you want to fight back probably, but your boyfriend, when they're saying that to your boyfriend, how did he react so calmly?
He didn't. He was shaking.
What were you saying to him to prevent him from throwing a punch?
I didn't make eye contact with them, Ainsley. I turned to him and I kept saying, this is what they want. Yeah. This is what they want. They want you to hit them. And I mean, they were literally this close to my face.
And what do you make of Maxine Waters saying we need to continue this if you don't agree with
you know what? She needs to come out. If she wants people to protest, that's one thing. But to continue this, they're inciting violence. It's not just yelling at someone and cursing at someone in a public place. They were trying to create a fight. So then we went into the movie, and I said, I'm not going to leave. By then, there were marked units everywhere. And so after the movie, they said, do you want to go out the back door? And I said, no way. I'm not going to be bullied by them. We're walking out the door that we came in.
So then that's the video we saw. And you walk out and you can hear the lady screaming.
And that's the aftermath. And the irony is that they didn't even know who their congressman was. But after the fact, they had 2 hours to rally troops and start reading all these issues. And so that's when they started yelling that. But I can protect myself. And now I've educated the people I'm with how to act when this happens. You know, he didn't know what to do.
Well, they're preaching tolerance, but then screaming intolerance in your face.
Exactly.
So now, I mean, are you tempted to wear sunglasses and a baseball hat and put your hair up? I mean, do you even want to be recognized now?
I try that. It doesn't work, but you know, no, I'm not going to change my life. That's what they want. And since this video, a state senator and a state rep, both women, have called me. They have been confronted.
Have you noticed
they're
just targeting women?
Yeah, oh, that's what I've seen. Because they're bullies, and I'm not going to be bullied.
So, again, that just gives you a little bit of a sense of what took place. And, again, this is the Attorney General of the state of Florida. If you're looking to find someone to blame, of course, right now, nobody really cares. They're going to blame everybody. But as you look at even what today Jim Dennison has posted, he talks about the fact that the Attorney General Pam Bondi was bullied at a movie screening in Tampa by hecklers who had to be deterred by her security personnel. And then goes on to say that in light of what we've already heard from Maxine Waters and others, he said the rancor may not stop with political officials. MSNBC's Danny Deutsch said, if you vote for Trump, then you, the voter, you, not Donald Trump, are standing at the border like Nazis going, you here, you there. So even now, if you voted for him, you're guilty of that. And so is there any attempt to tamp it down? Well, let's give at least partial credit to a few leaders. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer responded to Maxine Waters by stating from the Senate floor, no one should call for the harassment of political opponents. That's not right. That's not American. And, of course, you have the former Speaker of the House, now the House Minority Leader, Nancy Pelosi, called for unity from sea to shining sea. But I don't think those comments are going to tamp down what is taking place. And Jim Dennison spent some time quoting from Glenn Harlan Reynolds, an individual that I followed over the years, a law professor writing for USA Today, in which he said, is America headed towards a civil war? Sanders Nielsen incidents show it has already begun. And so whether it's Kirsten Nielsen or Sarah Sanders, some people are already saying we're in the midst of a civil war. So we do our best in this program from time to time to give you some of the facts and figures and news and information. And so, again, as we come to the top of the hour here, let me just mention that we are encouraging you to do what you can to support this ministry. And we really want to equip you. I think of the story of Diane, who said she became interested in politics because of listening to Point of View. Then she moved to the Washington, D.C. area. And actually, I think it was her and her husband sponsored the radio station carrying the program, and then later they even came to her about doing a program, which became the number 2 program on that station, and her program had a significant impact on local politics. And she says, thank you, Point of View, for educating us and keeping us informed. And if you have been listening to this program, even just the short amount of time it's been on at the 12 o'clock hour, you know that we're trying to educate you, we're trying to empower you, and certainly equip you with all sorts of information so that you will make a difference in your community. So as you give, let me just mention that we have a match on the tables. That means your gift will be doubled. A gift of $20 becomes $40. A gift of $50 becomes $100. A gift of $100 becomes $200. So if nothing else, we encourage you, as we go to a break right now, to do one of two things. Either you can go to our website, pointofview.net, click on that button that says donate, and we have a nice story about the impact that your donation has made in the past, if you've given to us, or what your donations will do in the future. And so you can go to pointofview.net, click on that button that says donate, or if you'd like to talk to someone, and that is simple as well, you can call our pledge line number. That is 800-347-5151, 1-800-347-5151. And that will be an opportunity for you to not only give to this ministry, but see your donation doubled. And as we are in this last week before the end of our fiscal year, we certainly need to hear from you. So if you can help us out, please dial that number right now and make a gift. We'll be back right after this.
Ronnie fixes cars in a shop on his property. That allows him to earn a living for his family and be home to help care for Michael. Ronnie and Judy adopted Michael more than 20 years ago, knowing he would never walk or be able to care for himself. But through listening to Point of View, they were convicted that every life God gives is precious. So even though Ronnie is now 69 and Judy can't lift Michael anymore, every day is a labor of love and a testimony to their faith. Providing for their family isn't easy, and yet every month for almost 15 years, they've invested in Point of View. Some listeners have changed their communities and the nation. Ronnie and Judy changed everything for Michael. Your gift to Point of View in June is an investment in changed lives, and a matching challenge provides double the impact if you give in the next few days. Please give now. 1-800-347-5151 or visit pointofview.net. Make a difference for the future. That future is now. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. We're going to spend some time over the next couple of hours talking about addiction, but before we do so, let's get back into the news cycle for just a minute. The Supreme Court ruled today in a 5-4 decision that the so-called travel ban that was implemented by the Trump administration, you might call it Travel Ban 3.0, is indeed constitutional. This is one of those cases where, even though I would celebrate the fact that the court, I believe, ruled carefully and correctly based on the Constitution, it is a head shaker and a head scratcher for sure when we recognize that Article 2 of the Constitution gives the authority to the president. This could just as easily been a 9-0 decision, but again, as we talk about so often, these 4 liberal justices could not bring themselves to actually look at the Constitution, but instead, in kind of the dissent, talked about the animus or the bias or the motivation of the president, which even if you agree that he was motivated by an anti-Muslim bias, which I disagree with, you still have to say you look at the policy, not the motivation. Sometimes people with very good motives craft really bad and even unconstitutional policies, and sometimes people with bad motives actually craft constitutional policies. So you should look at the policy, not the person. But even more so, as in one of the arguments that was put forward, Chief Justice John Roberts gave the majority opinion, but in a concurring opinion, you have Samuel Alito reminding us that we have 50 Muslim-majority countries around the world, and only 5 were on the list. And when you look at the population, only about 8% of the Muslim world was affected at all by this. To say this was an anti-Muslim policy is to actually fly in the face of some of those facts and figures. We'll probably spend some more time talking about this tomorrow in our Millennial Roundtable, because we'll have not only Nick Pitts and myself, but Chelsea Ullman, and look at some of the legal issues. So one of these cases that we've been waiting for came down today, a 5-4 decision upholding the so-called travel ban. And another case that we've been looking at, even more significant, coming out of the state of California. You may remember we've talked with a number of people about this particular case because it has to do with the requirements that were set forth in a particular piece of legislation called the FACT Act, which stood for Freedom, Accountability, Comprehensive Care, and Transparency Act, that required pregnancy facilities. These would be pro-life pregnancy facilities, and only those. It was crafted just to affect the pro-life pregnancy centers, not Planned Parenthood or anybody else, that they would have to disclose and inform clients that there were abortions available to them, that this had to be posted on sheets that were 8.5 inches by 11, had to be in no less than 22% type, and this was just done in an effort to really begin to prevent the pregnancy centers from being able to actually function effectively. And so the case known as NIFLA, which stands for the National Institute of Family and Life Advocates, is the one that brought the case. And again, this was a 5-4 decision. Again, if I can say it one more time, this one should have been a no-brainer. This should have been a 9-0 because it's compelled speech. It is saying that you have to actually advertise in your particular facility something that you disagree with. you would never expect there would be legislation that would say that if you have a Chevy dealership that you would advertise for dealerships, or that in a vitamin place that you would have to advertise that vitamins may not be as effective as going to these doctors down the street, or whatever it might be. I mean, you can come up with scenario after scenario where we'd never permit that. But because this was the issue of abortion, that was enough. Again, it's hard to believe we got to this point, because this is such draconian legislation that it actually had to pass both the California Assembly and the California Senate, then be passed on, as it was signed by the governor, to the Ninth Circuit Court, which rejected the fact that this was compelling speech and had to create a new category called professional free speech, and said that the law then protected public health interests. And again, a 5-4 decision. If nothing else, illustrates that elections do have consequences. If Neil Gorsuch were not on the court right now, I doubt either of them would have been 5-4 victories for life and for the issue of protecting us from terrorists. But nevertheless, those are two cases that have come down today. We will talk more about those tomorrow, and we're going to focus some time and attention now on the issue of addiction, and in particular, Celebrate Recovery. I suspect that if I went out and asked some of you to explain a little bit about Celebrate Recovery, some of you, if you've been through the program or know people that have, would give a pretty good answer. But I suspect a lot of you would say, well, I've heard of it, but I just don't know much about it. And we are fortunate to have with us today Johnny Baker, who is really there from the very beginning. He's been on the staff of Celebrate Recovery since 2004. He's the pastor of Celebrate Recovery at Saddleback Church and has been there since 2012. He was an adult child of an alcoholic and chose to be an alcoholic himself. We'll talk more about his story in just a minute. He's really passionate about breaking the cycle of dysfunction. If you're not familiar with some of the material that is out there, he is the co-author of Celebrate Recovery's daily devotional, also Celebration Place and The Landing, also the associate editor of the Celebrate Recovery Study Bible, and this new book that has come out through Zondervan, The Road to Freedom, Healing from Your Hurts, Hang-Ups, and Habits. Johnny, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I am thrilled that you can really tell the story, because from the time you were a teenager to the time your parents got involved, you've really seen the genesis and the growth of Celebrate Recovery. Tell us our backstory for just a minute, if you might.
Sure thing. Thanks again for having me. But yeah, one of the things that I'm so excited about for me is that I have had this experience of being a part of Celebrate Recovery since 1991 when it was founded. So to tell you the story of that, though, I've got to back up a little bit and just let you know about my parents. So my parents have been married, a long time now, but there was a time in the late 80s that they were going through a really rough time where my dad was active in his addiction with alcoholism, and my mom said to him one night that after they got in a fight over going to get a piece of pie with friends, he didn't want to go, and she did. She said, either you get out or you go get counseling with me. And he chose to get out. And that started a 13-month separation between the two of them. But during that time, God really got a hold of my dad, and he started going to Alcoholics Anonymous and began a journey of sobriety and came home. And as they began to reconcile their marriage, he did some amazing things, like say he was sorry to my sister and I for the damage he had caused in our family, which he had never done to that point. And it was really then that I went, okay, this guy's different now. And he began this process of changing his life, and he asked us to come to church with us, which he hadn't done in a really long time. Wow. And we actually stopped asking him. And because part of what happened for him in his AA groups is that he knew his higher power was Jesus. He was raised a Christian, but he had just walked away from his faith for a long time. But in his particular AA groups, and I realize this isn't the experience that everybody has, but it was his sharing about Jesus as his higher power was frowned upon. And so as he came to our church, he had the experience that many people have when they hear Pastor Rick Warren teach for the first time, where it feels like he's speaking right to you. And he had that feeling when he came to Saddleback, that is. And that began his process of wanting to start Celebrate Recovery in our church.
We'll continue the story right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Earlier this month, I talked about how many liberal progressives complained that Alan Dershowitz had changed. Actually, they are the ones who have changed. And in a recent op-ed, Dershowitz explains how the ACLU has abandoned its original mission. He should know since he served on the national board in the early years of his career. He writes that the director of the American Civil Liberties Union has now acknowledged what should have been obvious to everyone over the past several years. The ACLU is no longer a neutral defender of everyone's civil liberties. I'm not sure how neutral the ACLU has been in the past, but I'll concede the point to him. He says that they used a key test back in those days, which he called the shoe on the other foot test. In other words, would you vote the same way if the shoe were on the other foot? He concludes that now the ACLU wears only one shoe, and it is on the left foot. Its color is blue. The organization now seems only interested in taking cases and supporting policies that promote progressive ideas in the Democratic Party. Some of us can remember when the ACLU would occasionally take a very controversial, high-profile case in which they would defend the rights of neo-Nazis or Klan members to march. An article in The New Yorker says the ACLU is getting involved in elections and reinventing itself for the Trump era. Not only is it getting involved in election campaigns, but it also plans to spend $25 million on races and ballot initiatives. This is quite a change for a group that used to be called nonpartisan. Frankly, the ACLU has been a left-leaning organization since its founding, but at least it tried to occasionally play both sides of the civil liberties question. That is no longer the case. It is now injecting itself and its ideologies in American politics. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Johnny Baker with us today, and his book is entitled The Road to Freedom, Healing from Your Hurts, Hang-Ups, and Habits. Over 200 pages, published by Zondervan. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link to the book and also to Johnny Baker. We'll get into that in just a minute. But, Johnny, I think you were illustrating a point that I think all of us have noticed, and that is you can go to some AA groups and they talk about a higher power, but they don't really defend or even identify the higher power as being God or Jesus Christ. And so when a Christian goes to a place, in this case, like Saddleback Church or others, you finally say, good, this is the connection I really needed at the very first juncture. And again, tell us the rest of the story about how that developed in your life.
Sure. Yeah, that's one of the big differences between celibate recovery and traditional recovery is that we say the higher power, the one and only higher power is Jesus Christ. So he began attending Saddleback here and joined some men's ministry groups and found that those groups weren't really ready to go as deep with some of his issues with alcoholism as he wanted to. So he did the only rational thing. He sat down and wrote Pastor Rick a short, concise, 13-page, single-spaced letter and outlined the vision for this program called Celibate Recovery. And they were confident, my parents were confident that Pastor Rick would find the right person to lead this ministry. And Pastor Rick called my dad in the office and said, great, John, do it. And Celibate Recovery was born in November of 1991.
Yes. And again, just it's so good that you were there at the very beginning because you can kind of speak to that. There's all sorts of information, sometimes misinformation about that. But you not only talk about your parents, but you yourself. I mean, you got involved at a pretty young age as well, I think as a teenager, correct?
That's right. Yeah, I sure did. I actually was invited to come along every Friday night because they decided that leaving 15-year-old me at home was probably not a great idea. They had a lot of wisdom about that, and they brought me along with them, and I actually became the leader of the first teens group, which was basically just sit around and complain about your parents. But I actually got into a step study with one of my mentors who was actually a leader of mine from the high school ministry, and a step study is where we go through some workbooks written by Pastor John to help us dig deeper into the steps. And I had that as a basis or a foundation for me at that time, just as a child of an alcoholic, or what we might call a codependent.
Well, we can kind of work our way through the book. You've got just a great introduction and really a little bit of the history. And in the interest of time, I'd like to take on a couple of those issues. And the first one you address is admitting you have a problem doesn't make you weak. But boy, is it difficult if you've ever been working with individuals that are dealing with any kind of addiction. In the second hour today, we'll be getting into sexual addiction, but whether it's alcohol, gambling, drugs, whatever it might be, admitting the problem is a very significant first step, maybe the most important step, don't you think?
I do, and in fact, that's true if your issue is not addictive by nature. There are a lot of people who attend Celebrate Recovery for issues that aren't drugs or alcohol or sex addiction or anything like that. And so maybe it's a pain in your past or something that you just wish you could stop doing, whatever that is. Yeah, admitting that you have a problem is the first step. And the first principle of recovery is realize I'm not God, and I admit that my life is unmanageable. That's really hard to do. And so helping someone see that that's actually not a sign of weakness to admit you have a problem, but it's a sign of strength to say, I'm going to exchange my strength for God's strength and find some real healing.
Well, and again, one of the things I love about your book is you spend some time helping us understand why. Why is it so hard for us to just turn it over to God? And you talk about, well, we think we should do it ourselves. We hear that all the time. We don't understand who God is, or we're afraid God will let us down. So there are some practical and theological reasons why admitting your problem is the first step, and oftentimes one of the most difficult steps.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, a lot of times we are afraid. We're afraid of a lot of different things. And whether, like you said, it's that God's going to let us down or that it's just not going to happen for us, it keeps us stuck. And as long as we don't admit we have a problem, that problem continues to own us. The Bible says that a man is a slave of anything that has conquered him. And as long as we can't talk about something, it owns us. We often say in recovery that you're as sick as your secrets. And so being able to talk about what's going on in your life and admitting you have a problem has great power.
Again, this book is just full of the life lessons. Of course, the first one we just looked at about admitting the problem isn't weakness, but a source of strength. But another one is life lesson number 2, covering up problems always makes them worse. A lot of people, I think, Johnny, well, if I just don't bring it up, it's not going to be an issue. If I don't talk to my spouse about it, it's not going to be a problem. If I don't even admit it to myself, it'll just go away. That just never works out, does it?
No, let me ask you, have you ever had a bill that needed to be paid? Did it ever get paid by leaving it unopened?
Yeah, just put it in the drawer and hope that it would take care of itself, right?
Exactly.
That worked out so well. As they like to say, how's that working for you there?
Exactly. So many of the times, though, we try to do that with our lives. We say, this is a problem that needs attention, but it's too hard, or I'm too afraid, or I'm too proud to deal with it. So I'm just going to cover it up. And many of us learn coping skills as children that turns into denial as adults. And so we just say, if I don't look at it, if I don't talk about it, if we don't bring it up, it'll just go away on its own. But the truth is, it only allows it to fester and grow and get worse and worse and worse.
Again, some great life lessons here, 10 in particular, in The Road to Freedom, Healing from Your Hurts, Hang-Ups, and Habits. By the way, we also have a link to celebraterecover.com. We also have, of course, information about Johnny Baker, as well as we have his Twitter account and Facebook page, so you can find some of that material as well. But let's, before we take a break, at least get into one more, and that is small, steady improvement lasts longer than overnight change. Johnny, this is the problem, because sometimes we hear these stories, these dramatic conversion stories, and I've even sat across the table from people who have been in the studio that have said, my father was an alcoholic, and the moment he accepted Jesus Christ, he never took another drink. And while there are those incredible stories, or I was a heroin addict, and after I became a Christian, I never had a desire for heroin or any opioid again. And I don't deny that maybe some of those happen, but they do us a great disservice because we think that if it doesn't happen overnight, and if we don't have some great monumental, significant change, then I'm a failure. And yet, really, it's slow and steady, just like running a marathon, isn't it?
It really is. And let me just say, for the people that have experienced that kind of deliverance, praise God. Praise God that he worked that way in their life. But what I would encourage them to do is to take a look behind them, because I think they'll find a trail or a wake of pain that they've left in their life. And so while they may not have the compulsion to use anymore, there's still people that are hurting behind them. And so going through a program or some counseling or something to help them deal with that can often lead to healing in the people's lives that they've affected. Now, to the point about slow, steady improvement, I feel for me that has been the way that I have changed. And we often talk about one day at a time in Celebrate Recovery. Many of us come to recovery wanting a microwave experience, but it really ends up being a crock pot, a really slow cooker experience that takes some time. But that slow, steady change is measurable, it's sustainable, and it's actual change. And so we can look back and we can say, look at all of these ways I've changed. I'm changing, and I've been changed. You know, I remember nights where I would lay in bed as the room spun around me after a night of drinking and saying, God, please help me stop. But I was forced every day to make the decision. Will I drink today or will I not drink today? And so it still was on me. Well, in recovery, what I've learned is that I have his power to help me overcome that temptation and to make those choices. And that change is going to come slowly. But when people see that change in my life, the small change, they can say, you know what, maybe that can happen for me as well. And that guy is really changing. As I said earlier, when my dad made his amends to me, that was the first step that I said, oh, this man is changing. This is not just the excuses anymore, but this is real change that's happening in him.
Wow. We need to take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue talking about the road to freedom and the road to recovery. And we have a link to celebraterecovery.com, a Christ-centered 12-step program. We'll get into some of the resources available on the website and a little bit more in the book. But let me just mention, as we've been talking about this week, where in the last week before the end of our fiscal year. And if you have not taken the time to stop for just a minute and go to our website, first of all, find out about this book, The Road to Freedom, but also to click on that button that says donate, we certainly encourage you to do so. As you support this ministry, you're really supporting other individuals. Elaine in Alaska, surrounded by lots of people who don't share her values and sometimes can be very critical of her. So listening to Point of View has helped her to be more bold. It's emboldened her to ask questions and to probe some of the lack of logic employed by some of those individuals. And one of the things we try to do so often is really address some of the issues that you're dealing with, in this case, the issue of addiction or recovery, or perhaps you're just dealing with the fact that you find yourself in a hostile situation. You want to know how to defend your faith, defend your views. We certainly want to equip you and empower you to do so. So again, as you support this ministry, you're supporting other individuals making a difference in their community. And as I mentioned earlier today, we have a match on the table, which means, again, that your gift of $10 becomes $20, your gift of $100 becomes $200. So take the time to visit the website, pointofview.net, click on that button, or you can call our pledge line, 800-347-5151. We'll be right back.
Nancy was uncomfortable, to say the least. As an introvert, she didn't like controversy. But when she learned that parents were prohibited from seeing the contents of a major standardized test, she knew her responsibilities as a parent needed to outweigh her discomfort. Her daughter turned out to be the only student in her district to opt out of the test, and one of just a handful in the entire state of Texas. But she stood her ground, and the next year, Point of View helped her unite with other parents to make a difference for their children. The world loves to force us into its mold and to mock believers when we resist. Your gift to Point of View is an investment in courage and changed lives. And because of a special matching challenge, your gift here in June will have double the impact. Be part of amazing transformations. It all starts with a simple phone call, 1-800-347-5151, or by clicking in to pointofview.net. One day, you were going to make a difference. That future is now. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Privileged to have with us today Johnny Baker. The book is entitled The Road to Freedom. It is published by Zondervan. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link there in case you can't find it and want to get it immediately. Of course, it's available in Kindle, hardback, and a variety of other venues and formats. So let me encourage you to go to our website, pointofview.net. But Johnny, let's also encourage people to go to the other website we have linked, and that is celebraterecovery.com. This is a place where people can get started. They may be hearing this right now and saying, this is exactly what I need. I didn't know it existed. Or I've heard about Celebrate Recovery, but we don't have one in our church, so I don't know how to connect up, or something of that nature. When they find that website, which we have on our website, what will they be able to do, and how can they begin to connect up with places and individuals that can help them with their recovery?
Yeah, sure. I think the most important thing they'll be able to do on that website is find a group in their area. And there is a tab there that says something like Find a Group. You click on that, and then you can put in your zip code even and see all the different Celebrate Recoveries in your area. Now, let's say you do that and you don't see any really close. There's something called Find a State Rep. And those are people, they're volunteers all over the country who help people get started in recovery and help Celebrate Recoveries run in their areas, and they would love to help you get connected to one that maybe isn't listed yet on the website. But then you can begin your own recovery journey, and it's so important that people hear this, that no matter what you're going through, no matter what hurt, hang-up, or habit you're going through right now, recovery can help you. You may not be somebody who needs to stay in recovery forever, but you might just need to come do it for a little while and get some healing and some help over some issues, and then you can go back out. You may find that you're like me, though, and you're going to keep digging into different areas of your life and be what I call a lifer in recovery and continue to go through that. But I would encourage you, if you're listening to this and you find that there's something in your life that you're just going, God, I wish this was gone, or I wish I could overcome this, I would encourage you to check out Celebrate Recovery in a church near you, and you're going to find people who love you. They're not going to judge you or make you feel like you shouldn't be there. Don't worry, you're not going to have a sign over your head that tells everybody why you're coming, but you're going to be met with people who are in recovery themselves. Every one of us, whether we're leaders or whether we're first-time participants, when we're in Celebrate Recovery, we're all in the program. And so no one there is going to judge you or make you feel like you shouldn't be there, but they're going to welcome you and help you as you begin your journey to find some freedom in your life.
Again, celebraterecovery.com. There's a section on about, events, resources. And again, he mentioned the CR groups. Find a group or find your state rep. And again, we have all that available at our website. And let me encourage you to either go to our website and find it or go directly there. We're talking about some of these life lessons. And again, when we get into some of those, admitting you have a problem doesn't make you weak. Covering up problems always makes them worse. Steady and small improvements last longer than overnight change. But that brings us to life lesson 4. Pain has purpose. I don't think people want to hear that, Johnny, but nevertheless, that is reality, isn't it?
It sure is, yeah, and I agree. I don't think many people, myself included, want to hear that. But it is important to know that you're not going through pain just for no reason whatsoever. God wants to use the pain in our lives, and the first purpose of pain is that it gets our attention. For many of us, we're walking away from God, or we're walking out of his will. And God's going to allow pain in our lives to increase to get our attention. C.S. Lewis said that God whispers to us in our pleasure, but he shouts to us through our pain. And it's such a good way for us to turn our hearts back to God. The second purpose for pain is that it allows us to help other people when they go through pain. The Bible tells us that God is the Father of all comfort, and that he comforts us when we go through hard times so that we can comfort other people when they go through similar hard times. And so one of the purposes of pain is that we get to be a comfort for people who are in pain. And to me, that is such a huge part of this, where when I go through a hard time, I can look at it and say, I'm not happy I'm going through this at all, but I know God's going to redeem this pain. He's going to use it to get my attention. And someday I'm going to help somebody else who's going through something really similar to this.
Let's, if we can, talk about some of the others, because you talk about Jesus cares deeply about your pain, but also combine that with another life lesson: facing your pain and mistakes is the only way to deal with them. We've already talked about the fact you don't want to cover them up. You don't want to cover up your problems, but sometimes pain, as you said, is an attention getter, but it also is a way to change courses in your life, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And I think knowing that Jesus cares deeply about your pain, that it's not just something that he's putting up with, but he cares about it. One of my favorite verses is to cast your anxiety on him because he cares for you.
Yes.
And it's so important for me to know that it's not just don't worry, but instead it's let me give this to Jesus who loves me and cares about me. It's such a huge game changer, at least in my life. And then to deal with our past pain and mistakes, it's really the game changer, because when we are able to write down in what we call an inventory, we look at all the good and bad we've done and all the good and bad that's been done to us. And let me tell you, this is a tough part of recovery, but it's a doable part of recovery, and it's so important because it allows us to see things as they really are, not as I tell myself. Sometimes I can minimize things, and sometimes I can overblow things. And when I can see them in real life, in black and white on a page, now all of a sudden I can begin to deal with them. And when I mean deal with them is I mean that there may be something I need to do. There may be something that will help me later on if I deal with it. And I look at it and I say, you know what, that pain in my past needs to stay in my past, or that fear in the future is actually just a fear. It's not true. And so by dealing with those things head on, we're able to find freedom from them because they no longer hurt us in the today, and it's in today that we really live.
Outstanding. Just before we get back into the book, you have a section there about normal. You know, I've heard the old laying that what's normal, and normal, as we jokingly sometimes say, is a setting on your washing machine. But there are people all the time, Johnny, that will say, well, is this normal? Is this pain normal? Is this reaction normal? Of course, you sometimes say that to your doctor. Is it normal for my hand to look like this? So talk about that, because you do address that issue as well. What are normal people? I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Normal people are people who decide they actually don't have any problems. See, in our culture, it's really tempting to look around and keep up with the Joneses and just kind of present this face to the world that says, I've got it all together. In recovery, we call that denial. Those people, on the other hand, are those poor people who have decided they actually need help. And so a lot of times in recovery circles, people will say, I'm one of those people, because there's been this feeling that people who are in recovery have been sort of treated like those wounded soldiers who need help, or those poor people who can't overcome, or that can't pull it all together. And we've kind of redeemed that language and said, yeah, you're right, I am one of those people. I have to lean on God's power. I have to lean on God's help. I can't do it on my own. Or normal people like to pretend like they have it all together, that there's no problem in their life. See, normal people don't talk about their pain. Normal people don't do something about it. They just kind of keep living in it. Those people, we do something about it. And so I would encourage you to become one of those people, to join us, because it's where you can find freedom. Pastor Rick Warren always says there's two kinds of people in the world: those who know they need recovery and those who are in denial.
Good line. Just before we take a break, let's get into one more, life lesson number 7. Keeping short accounts is necessary for relational change. I know that one of the things that really motivates you is trying to break this cycle of dysfunction in families, because you just take one problem. And matter of fact, I have a message I've given over the years, broken branches in your family tree. And you see this in the book of Genesis. So you don't even have to go to the second book of the Bible before you see whether it's Abraham or Isaac or Jacob or Joseph or whatever. You just see that these broken branches are a problem. And part of it has to do with this issue of changing these relationships, which oftentimes are quite dysfunctional.
That's right. Yeah, and for us to find relational change, which is not just, like you say, about breaking the cycle of dysfunction in our family, but to heal a marriage, or for a strained relationship between a spouse or between siblings, or whatever those relationships are like, to find some true healing in those relationships. What I mean by short accounts is that we offer forgiveness and we make amends quickly, that we don't hold on to those things anymore. Making amends, by the way, is or saying I'm sorry, is one of the quickest ways to show people that we've actually changed. If you look at how we talk to each other, when I apologize, or when politicians apologize or celebrities apologize, it's always, I'm sorry, or I'm sorry you were offended.
Yes.
But those kinds of apologies, they don't really convey any repentance or any sorrow at all, in fact. And so when we say to somebody, hey, I'm sorry I let you down, without an explanation, or I'm sorry I said that instead of I'm sorry you heard that, or I'm sorry I was late, or whatever, when we just apologize without making excuses, it shows that we're changing. It shows that we're different. Now, if that person wants to have a conversation about why, well, then sure, we can have a conversation. But so often when I need to apologize, I have reasons. When you need to apologize, you have excuses. And so sometimes just having that I'm sorry I hurt you moment can really convey that we've changed. On the other side of the coin, offering forgiveness when someone has hurt us and not holding a grudge, it forgives them, but it actually lets us off the hook. The Bible says that we're to forgive other people when they hurt us, and as hard as that may be to hear, it's so important. But I do want to point out that this can often be a process. And so if someone's been deeply hurt that's listening to this, going to a Celebrate Recovery ministry and finding that help is going to be really key to that.
We'll take a break and be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. A recent article out of Canada reports that ethicists are recommending that conscience laws be modified for the medical profession. The argument suggests that physicians should not have the right to opt out of providing such services as prescribing contraceptives when a patient requests such services. According to the authors, quote, doctors must put patients' interest ahead of their own integrity. If this leads to feelings of guilt or remorse or them dropping out of the profession, so be it, unquote. That is truly shocking language that we should take note of, especially since, as the article in the National Post points out, every country in the civilized world recognizes at least some form of conscientious objection. Not only do the authors suggest that certain professions should be closed to those whose integrity would require the abandonment of the conscience to practice it, it fails to understand what conscience actually is. The reason we provide protections for the exercise of conscience is because people should not be made by the government to make their conscience optional. As Dr. Robert George of Princeton University has put it, quote, the right of conscience is a right to do what one judges oneself to be under an obligation to do, unquote. We will see whether Canada takes up the proposal by its professors, but south of the border, we must be vigilant that we never permit the government to make optional what our Creator has made obligatory. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we continue our conversation with Johnny Baker today, talking about the book, The Road to Freedom and Celebrate Recovery. Let's take a phone call real quickly. We'll go up to Missouri, KNEO. Kay, thank you for joining us today. What would you like to add to our conversation?
Well, I was telling the young man that answered the phone that after the Joplin tornado in 2011, they started a Celebrate Recovery here at our church. And I thought, I'm a Christian, and I lived, and I didn't die, and I should have. I was in Walmart. And so I thought, well, I can go and I can help these young people. So I went in, and I'm there because I think I'm helping them. And there's a thing called step study that you do, and an inventory list you take. And I did that with the other girls, thinking, well, they did it, I should do it also. So I did it. And when I did it, I realized that I had been Christian a long time, but in my younger years, I had some real issues, and I didn't serve the Lord. And I could see that there was something in my life that was a sexual problem, and I never knew why. I just couldn't understand it. So I took my step study, the inventory list, to my sisters when I went back home on a visit, and I said, look at this. It shows in here that I have a problem, and this is it, and you can see it all through my life there. And they told me, well, Katie, don't you remember what happened? And I didn't remember it. I didn't even know it had ever happened, what had happened to me. And so here I am, a Christian, and the Lord lets me go through this thinking I'm helping someone else, and it helped me. So I think just because people, you may not think you have a problem, but God wants to deliver us from everything. And step study and that in our program can really do that for you.
Very
and
good.
I would advise anybody that get a chance, go on in and help them and go through the study yourself. It will help you. So, and I'm an old lady now, and I'm 70 years old, and it helps an old lady. So thank you, Lord.
Thank you. Johnny, I think it just illustrates she went in to help others and found out it helped her.
I love it. It happens so often that way, and so I'm so proud of her for doing that and for deciding to go through that process herself. And that's exactly what we were talking about dealing with that past pain is the way to go through it.
You know, life lesson number 8 is people are hurting in ways you may never see or know. I wanted to add one more. In some cases, you may be hurting and not know that you're hurting yourself. And that was the case of Kay, don't you think?
It was, yeah, definitely. I agree. Yeah, and many times when we go about our lives, we forget that other people are going about their lives too, and they're hurting, and they're maybe going through things that you'll never see. And so it just helps us to understand that other people are hurting, and it should help us be a little kinder, a little gentler with people, and help us just see that we're not the only ones going through stuff.
And again, one of the other things you talk about here is there's no one God doesn't love, won't forgive, or can't change. So sometimes we say, well, am I outside of God's love? This is happening because God doesn't love me. This pain is in my life because there is a judgment coming on my life. And there can be some truth to a little of that, as we've already alluded to. But this is a lesson that I think we also need to pass on to people that Celebrate Recovery really talks about what God can do in your life.
Yeah, to me, this is maybe the most important lesson. It's the one that was the most important for me to write, at least, because as I was writing it, I kept getting struck with this idea of, like, who do you think you are to write this book and to do this thing? And through that process, God really said to me, well, you're my child, and I love you, and you're changing. And that was so important and so impactful for me. And I think it is tempting to think, I've just sinned too many times. I've blown it too often, or I've gone too far away. And I'll tell you, you'd be amazed at the amount of people who have said to me, well, Johnny, you don't know where I've been. You don't know what I've done. And I just say, you're right, I don't. But I know that Jesus still loves you, and he still died for those sins just as much as anything else. And it's important for us to know that no matter what happens, Jesus loves us, and he wants to help us as we go through our lives, and that there's nothing that you've done that he won't forgive. There's nobody he can't change, and he loves every single person. It's such an important part of this process that you're not alone.
Well, again, the book is entitled The Road to Freedom, Healing from Your Hurts, Hang-Ups, and Habits, published by Zondervan, over 200 pages. We have a link to celebraterecovery.com. And, Johnny, just before we let you go, let's talk about how people could connect, because as they go through that website, they can find a place maybe in their backyard they didn't even know existed where Celebrate Recovery takes place. If they want to start a new one or cannot find one in their locality, they can contact their state director. So there is help out there. So the next step is for people to visit that website and take that first step.
That's right. And I would encourage you, too, if you're looking for this, to find somebody safe to talk to, maybe somebody you know who's been in Celebrate Recovery, and ask them for help. And if you're in Celebrate Recovery now, this may be a good opportunity for you to say, hey, check out this this thing I just listened to, and maybe you want to attend Celebrate Recovery with me as well.
Well, again, thank you for writing the book and pulling together all of the history as well as these various life lessons. And each one of them is just power-packed, and we could cover them for a long period of time. But the first step is to get involved where that conversation can take place. So, Johnny, thanks for joining us today here on Point of View, and thank you for writing the book.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
We're going to take a break. Just before we do so, though, as we've mentioned, we are encouraging you to help others make an impact. And I thought it would be appropriate in this last week before the end of our fiscal year for you to hear from a number of individuals. And yesterday we heard from people like Vicky Garza and Michelle Bachman and Rodney Hare and Kelly Shackelford. I thought you might want to hear from Jamie Jordan about, again, how your gift makes a difference in the lives of other individuals.
I started listening to Point of View in 1985. We moved from Little Rock, Arkansas to Conroe, Texas. Marlon Maddox was the host back then, and I remember that he used to call it the Head in the Sand Club, that his kind of mission in life was to pull people's heads out of the sand, and my head certainly was in the sand. And at the time, I was a theistic evolutionist because I believed what they taught about Genesis, and as far as God created the world, but I also went to public school and believed what they taught about evolution. I didn't really understand the intellectual conflict, the politics, didn't really understand. I was always kind of conservative by nature, but didn't really understand what was going on. And today, the lies from the dominant media culture are just so rampant. And Point of View is such a breath of fresh air to have the truth told. And, you know, a little light in a dark space makes a lot of light. You can be in a black, dark cave, and one little candle will light up everything. I think Point of View, more than anything besides my parents, has influenced my worldview and my thinking. And to me, it's just really scary to think where I would be if it hadn't been for the influence of Point of View had on my life.
Appreciate Jamie talking about that. And, of course, we heard this last week in some of the material that I was just reading from Ashley in Georgia, talking about, again, you know, the kind of learning that takes place. Sometimes, you said, I used to have a tendency to get hot-headed when I would encounter a non-believer, and sometimes I'd wonder how to defend this. And I think we've had, testimony after testimony for others saying, first of all, I wanted to get some of the facts and figures. I also wanted to learn how to have a civil discussion about the issues, wanted to learn how to witness, wanted to learn how to defend my faith. This is why we do Point of View, that you can learn how to articulate a biblical worldview and also know how to defend a biblical worldview. So your gift helps these individuals make a difference in their community. And so I ask you to, as we go to a break right now, go to the website, pointofview.net, and click on that button that says Donate. Or, of course, if you would like to talk to someone, you could do that as well. Our pledge line number is 800-347-5151.
Ronnie fixes cars in a shop on his property. That allows him to earn a living for his family and be home to help care for Michael. Ronnie and Judy adopted Michael more than 20 years ago, knowing he would never walk or be able to care for himself. But through listening to Point of View, they were convicted that every life God gives is precious. So even though Ronnie is now 69 and Judy can't lift Michael anymore, every day is a labor of love and a testimony to their faith. Providing for their family isn't easy, and yet every month for almost 15 years, they've invested in Point of View. Some listeners have changed their communities and the nation. Ronnie and Judy changed everything for Michael. Your gift to Point of View in June is an investment in changed lives, and a matching challenge provides double the impact if you give in the next few days. Please give now, 1-800-347-5151, or visit pointofview.net. Make a difference for the future. That future is now. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. This hour we're going to spend some time talking about all sorts of sexual issues, and it will range from pornography to sexual assault and sexual harassment, the Me Too movement, and much more. And, of course, when you have two very articulate individuals here, I'm just going to sit back and let them kind of educate us about some of these topics. Noel Bouché is certainly no stranger to our listeners here at Point of View. He is with Pure Hope Ministry, an individual who graduated from South Dakota State University and the University of Texas School of Law. And Noel, just always great to have you in studio with us.
Great to be here, Kerby. Thank you again for having us and for always creating such a great platform for ministry and your generosity with it. It's wonderful to be here.
And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about Pure Hope with you and the video movie that went out and a number of other resources. I might just mention we've also posted a Life-Giving Rhythm, so you can find some links there as well. And a good friend that I have known for, I hate to admit it now, it's getting into decades here. Mary DeMuthe, who I remember the first time was in 3 different studios since this time when we first met. And since that time, I've counted more than 30 books in more than 5 languages. Is that fair? You know,
yes, that is fair.
That is. And again, not only you're a writer, but I just found out your daughter's a writer and some others. So it's just great to have you here. And of course, anybody that's read any of your fiction books know what an incredibly gifted writer you are. Anybody who's read some of your nonfiction, especially as you shared about your own issues with sexual struggles, knows that you have a real heart for this topic. So it's just a great opportunity to have 2 of you in the same studio at the same time. But Noel, help us out. Pure Hope Ministries, and what are some of the guidelines that you sort of bring together to help people really deal with this issue of sexual assault and sexualized culture?
Yeah, thanks, Kerby. It's a privilege to be a part of a ministry like Pure Hope. It spans the country and increasingly the world as we build partnerships out internationally, all built around the mission of shaping a world free of sexual exploitation and brokenness by equipping parents especially, parents but other leaders, to confidently lead their families and those in their care through a sexualized culture. And I think that speaks for itself. Many of your listeners will agree we live in a sexualized culture, a digital age that is sexually exploitative in ways that are new, that are newly intense, and something that we deal with every day. And, of course, this is in the headlines in manifold ways over the last few years, if we just look back a few years. And so, again, our target audience is really parents, and the Holy Spirit has led us to that strategic decision over the years. And I've been brought there personally. I, as you mentioned, went to law school, and one of the reasons I did that was my wife and I were exposed to the injustice of human trafficking and the global sex trade, and we wanted to do something. And so we thought we'd go get a degree and go save the world. And what you realize when you start kind of looking into that darkness is that trafficking into the sex trade, exploitation doesn't just happen over there somewhere, wherever we first think it is. It happens all around us.
Right.
And it also continues to grow because of cultural factors. And so you start to learn that, boy, the objectification, the silence, the media, the way we are talking, the way even our theology can be skewed if we're not careful, can lay a fertile soil for that exploitation. And so that's really where I've been drawn. My wife is a professor at TCU in different ways. But that for me was eye-opening, because even the State Department a few years ago in their Trafficking in Persons report says citizens, ministers, parents need to lay the groundwork for changing a world in which trafficking exists. They need to change the cultural soil, that boys will be boys, that it doesn't matter, that she wants it, the rape myth. Those things need to be changed by parents. And so that has really been where we've been focusing, equipping parents to parent well in a sexualized culture. If you go to purehope.net, your listeners will see our Quest series that's available on Right Now Media for churches to use, as well as a conference experience we've developed to really go through the pain points with biblical and practical answers that we think parents need.
You know, you mentioned sexual trafficking. I remember the first time we had former Congresswoman Linda Smith in here, and that goes back, again, decades, and that was the first time I think we'd ever talked about that on the program. But now I think most people in the church understand that and understand that that's an issue. So in some respects, back in the old days when the ministry that you're with was started by Jerry Kirk, nobody had really been thinking about this. So we've made at least some progress, haven't we?
Oh, I mean, when our founder, Reverend Jerry Kirk, started the ministry, that was 1983. I like to tell people that Pure Hope is a startup on a 35-year foundation because of some of the innovation we're doing. But we have a 35-year foundation. And back in 1983, you were talking about pornography. People are like, what? I don't see it. There was no VHS.
That's right.
There was no internet, of course. It was just back alleys. But there was vision from the pulpit to see how this was exploitative and ripping lives apart, ripping families apart. And so that vision has been part of our journey. And I met Linda Smith about 10 years ago and had the same kind of response out in Washington State when I met her. And it was part of my journey, realizing that what I do in my home, what I do with my eyes, my mind, my thought, words, and deed, the way I love my daughters every day is my first act of justice. That is where it must start. And so the pursuit of purity and holiness and healing and redemption is the church's first job in doing justice.
Well, Mary, let's come to you. I think anybody who's heard you speak know that you come to this having been a victim yourself and having dealt with this issue of sexual exploitation. And if nothing else, a little bit later, I want to talk about some lessons the church still needs to learn in this regard, right? But tell the story, if you might.
Yeah, so I've told my story here several times, but I was a victim of sexual abuse by neighborhood boys, teenagers in the early 70s. And it was just one of those things where I couldn't get myself out of it. I did my best. I told my babysitter. I was one of the very few victims who told right away. And she said that she would tell my mom, and I believed her, but it continued to go on for that entire kindergarten career. I haven't shared this part of my story much, but I'm beginning to feel free to do so. I believe that my father was also grooming me in a very specific way to be his next victim. And he passed away before that fully was realized, but I definitely was on the trajectory there. And he was a purveyor and a creator of pornography and a consumer of it as well, way before any of this happened. And so I feel like God has given me a voice to speak into this industry and the terribleness of it, because there are pictures of me that he took that I have. I probably should destroy them, that, I have no clothes on. And so, it's hard to share that, but I feel like I need to be able to give people hope to say, if I was raised in a sexualized environment where I was being preyed on constantly and being groomed by my own father, and I'm okay today because of the grace and power of Jesus Christ, then I uniquely am in a position to offer hope to people who have porn on their phones.
Yes. Well, and again, one of the reasons you bring this up is because I think both of you recognize that if you look at this abuse or trafficking, you got to go back upstream to the issue of pornography, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And it's, like you said, it's the victimization and I think also in terms of predatory behavior, that rape myth of that if she says no, she actually means yes. And I think it's a terrible, terrible precedent. And I think it feeds and fuels all of the sin that continues to go from there.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to get into maybe some things that we can do in our homes and in our churches, and maybe some lessons the churches still need to learn. Because if you have been paying attention, you know that some around the table have said, there's some places where the church has real major gaps, and we need to try to do some education. And when we have such a large megaphone, which is called Point of View, we're going to do our best to try to educate. So let's take a break. If you find yourself saying, okay, I want to know a little bit more about Noel Bouché and Mary DeMuthe, we have their links on the website. We have links to their Twitter feeds and their Facebook pages and other resources. And if you want to contact them or you want to get some of those Quest materials at Pure Hope, it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Earlier this month, I talked about how many liberal progressives complained that Alan Dershowitz had changed. Actually, they are the ones who have changed. And in a recent op-ed, Dershowitz explains how the ACLU has abandoned its original mission. He should know since he served on the national board in the early years of his career. He writes that the director of the American Civil Liberties Union has now acknowledged what should have been obvious to everyone over the past several years. The ACLU is no longer a neutral defender of everyone's civil liberties. I'm not sure how neutral the ACLU has been in the past, but I'll concede the point to him. He says that they used a key test back in those days, which he called the shoe on the other foot test. In other words, would you vote the same way if the shoe were on the other foot? He concludes that now the ACLU wears only one shoe, and it is on the left foot. Its color is blue. The organization now seems only interested in taking cases and supporting policies that promote progressive ideas in the Democratic Party. Some of us can remember when the ACLU would occasionally take a very controversial, high-profile case in which they would defend the rights of neo-Nazis or Klan members to march. An article in the New Yorker says the ACLU is getting involved in elections and reinventing itself for the Trump era. Not only is it getting involved in election campaigns, but it also plans to spend $25 million on races and ballot initiatives. This is quite a change for a group that used to be called nonpartisan. Frankly, the ACLU has been a left-leaning organization since its founding, but at least it tried to occasionally play both sides of the civil liberties question. That is no longer the case. It is now injecting itself and its ideologies in American politics. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
But once again, we are privileged to have in studio with us today Noel Bouché and Mary DeMuthe. And Mary, let me come back to this whole issue. How extensive is this? You know, we're now starting to hear more and more women coming forward in the Me Too movement who have never said this before. And a lot of this is covered in secrecy. So when we try to even have a handle on how much sexual abuse, sexual harassment is taking place, you recognize those numbers are underreported, but how extensive is this?
Yeah, just to make it a round figure, it's about 6 of 10, I believe, is the current stat of girls and a little less for boys. But
Wow.
Because it's so underreported, and we have to understand the nature of sexual abuse, that can be also sexual harassment and having unwanted touch that isn't, super invasive. It still is all part of that. And because it's so underreported, and every time I speak and I share that story, I get a line afterwards of people saying, thanks for saying that from the pulpit, or thanks for saying that from the front, because I thought I was the only one. And I think we're now with Me Too, we're beginning to see the more there are brave people that will say, I have been there, the more we open up the door to healing to this extremely pervasive problem. And if we think it's not in the church, we're deceiving ourselves. It is absolutely within the church.
Let's talk to pastors for just a minute, because sometimes when we talk about, say, abortion, I say, recognize that if you have a representative congregation,
right,
and then I give the percentage of women who might have had an abortion, that's something to think about, because as you just pointed out, it is rarely, if ever, mentioned from the pulpit. What should be in the minds of a pastor, a Sunday school teacher, a small group leader when he or she is looking in front of a group of individuals that are representative? This is something that they are carrying as a hidden secret that they've never told anybody. True?
It's absolutely true. I was recently at a church called Restore Austin, and the Pastor Zach there, he had me come down and do the Sunday service because he was tired of his congregation not, feeling like they had been heard or that they'd even been represented. And so I just applaud that kind of effort of pastors bringing in stories. And even if that means maybe one Sunday a year where they bring in hard stories, 15 minutes each, and so that people out in the pews don't think I'm the only person with this story and I'm going to go to my grave with it. And then they're just going to suffer because, as I've told before, many audiences, an untold story never heals. We need to let it out, especially with safe people.
Yes, and we talked about that in the last hour with Johnny Baker, that covering it over doesn't work very well, and he has a great illustration. He said, now, have you ever had a bill where you decide, well, maybe I'll just put it in the drawer and it will pay itself, And we know
I wish that would happen.
Yeah. And that doesn't happen with bills, and it doesn't happen with pain and problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, Noel, let's talk about solutions. I want to give some people a chance to call in and ask for solutions, but you've got some great resources that already are in existence. Talk about those.
We do, and I'll say first that resources, like anything, comes out of your culture. It comes out of your ministry, your heart, your passion, your talent that's around you, the people. And I was thinking with, Mary's courage right now, sharing something almost in a new way. I know that there are listeners right now who are being impacted because the Holy Spirit is moving through this segment right now in a profound way. But we had a board meeting, and one of our longer-serving board members said, they talk about silent epidemics out there, but that we have something new now. We have an epidemic of silence. And just the phrase really shut us down for a moment to sit in that, bask in that, and pray about that, because it really is the issue, and it's the tool of our adversary, the accuser, to do that, to lock you away. We'll talk about the Heart of Man movie here in a bit, but in that cave of shame where the lie pummels you that you're the only one. And the way we do that is we break the silence. We break the power of the secret in our lives, which takes a lot of courage, which like Mary just did on the radio nationwide, sharing a part of her story she hadn't. But courage from the Latin, as you know, comes from the word heart.
Yeah.
And when our hearts are healed through community, we can come to that place where we share and be a light for others. And I think that's so important. We were at a church recently kind of teaching their staff on how to really lead in this sexualized culture. How do we equip parents? How do we deal with what our teenagers are dealing with, where 90% are being exposed to porn, before age 13, and sexting and everything else that we as parents and leaders are dealing with. And they said, how do we do this? And we said, well, first of all, we create a culture of grace. And one of them said, okay, but practically, how do I create a culture of grace? And the first thing I said was, do you ever use the word pornography? Like, have you ever talked about pornography? Preached on it? Do you talk about it? He goes, we've got a men's accountability structure. That's not one of the questions we ask. It's not one of the topics we talk about. And anyone who's kind of alive right now realizes
you missed the elephant in the room, right?
It's the wallpaper on our very digital existence right now. Yeah. So, when you can't use the word, you are giving power to the lie and to the evil one. And here's the thing. God created the cosmos with words. And yet we in the church are afraid to mention certain words that describe topics that within that topic are categories and vast swaths of people who are being isolated right in our midst. So breaking the power of the secret and being equipped. And if you go to PureHOPE.net, that's what we're trying to do, to equip parents to break the power of the secret, to be able to talk about these issues. A, understand what the Bible says in session 1, which we call the foundation. B, how to develop an ongoing dialogue with your kids. Not a one-time sex talk, but an ongoing dialogue that uses teachable moments, that uses real-life scenarios, headlines, to be able to open up the discussion. We could talk for hours about our dinner table, which you can imagine is a lively one because of our topics. But then how do we deal with the technology? And then most importantly, how do we model this for our kids? How do we leave a legacy of openness, of redemption? Because none of us are perfect. And if we're silent on something, we're telling those around us that we are perfect, and we're furthering the shame, saying, why are you struggling with that? Because I sure ain't. I'm not talking about it.
Sure. Well, I might as well open up the phone since the phones are ringing. 1-800-351-1212 if you'd like to join our conversation today. 1-800-351-1212. You mentioned one resource, but you alluded to another one, the Heart of a Man movie. Of course, we've had the trailer on our website. People can go and find out more there. But what a great resource, especially if you have a men's ministry, really want to get into that. The Cave of Shame. Explain a little bit of that in case some of our listeners are not familiar with the movie.
Sure, and thanks again. It's such a resource, and you've had us on before. You've had my colleague Jasper Hall, Jason Paymer, our producer, a couple of times with me. The Heart of Man movie is an independent film that we helped executive produce at PureHOPE. A wide community of people came around that, donors, ministries, talent, of course, the people who shared their stories courageously in the film. But it is a genre-breaking film. It's dual genre. It is a narrative, a reimagined prodigal son parable that was shot on location on the Big Island of Hawaii. Beautiful retelling of the prodigal son parable and the cave that we find ourselves in of shame, and how the Father comes down and rescues us in the person of Jesus Christ and redeems us. And it's beautifully told, but it's woven together with real stories of brokenness, sexual brokenness, porn addiction, infidelity, same-gender attraction, sexual abuse. Touches all of these topics in a way that just opens up a place that so many of us have not been able to go. In fact, if you go to Facebook, Heart of Man Movie, you'll see story after story of people writing in. We get emails every day from around the world saying, this has changed my view of the Father. It's changed my view of myself, and it's changed my understanding of his love that does not stop pursuing me. And so it's available at heartofmanmovie.com. It's on Right Now Media. It's on Netflix, iTunes. We have done a U.S. theatrical release last year, which tens of thousands of people were impacted by. Actually, Jason and Justin, who plays the prodigal character, are in Australia right now for screenings. It's been an incredible ride, and I think it's just beginning to impact the church. We did a men's retreat. Here's a quick story. We did a men's retreat with a church in the Midwest this spring that they worked with us to build the retreat around the scenes of the film, which is what the study guide and participant guide does. If you engage with that, these scenes are metaphors for the stages of our lives. And so we built this retreat around it, and we built, men's, guys stuff, tearing stuff down, playing, paintball, and we had teachings. And after each teaching, after each scene of the film, we had fire pits. Around just one fire pit, there were 6 guys. All of them had been sexually abused as boys by a family member and had never talked about it. So again, these tools help us start a conversation, find the courage to share with someone who's a safe place, and help the church become a safe place, because as Mary was so courageously communicating to the masses last week, we have not been a safe place.
Yeah. Well, again, epidemic of silence and a silent epidemic. So interestingly enough, how that has come together. We have some phone calls, so we'll take some of those. 1-800-351-1212. Noel Bouché with us and Mary DeMuthe. And just as we take a break, let me just mention we are in the last week of our fiscal year end. And so if you appreciate the fact that we're addressing these issues, our May issue is on understanding the Me Too movement and an over-sexualized culture. We certainly do encourage you to do what you can to help us out financially. That number is 800-347-5151 for the pledge line. It's different than the, of course, on-air number, which I'll give again in just a minute. And, of course, you can also go to the website, pointofview.net. As you go there, you're going to find all the different links that we have provided for you today. Of course, Noel Bouché's website is purehope.net. It has a Living in the Loop campaign, and also we have some material that we've posted here about giving rhythm to life. And then, of course, we also have a link to marydemuthe.com. And so if you need any of those resources, they're available at the website. But as you go there, you can also click on that button. And a donation would certainly be appreciated, especially since we have a match on there. So your gift of $50 becomes $100. $100 becomes $200. So we'll take a break. We'll start taking some phone calls and continue our conversation right after this.
The young man burst into tears. He was in obvious distress. But thankfully, Don Blight had the exact answers he needed. God took a chance encounter in a restaurant bathroom of all places and turned it into a divine appointment that forever impacted a young couple and saved the life of their unborn child. Don was able to help because he was prepared. And where does Don Blight get some of the information and resources he needs to be ready for the next opportunity? He listens to Point of View. He listens because others like you took action. This is your opportunity to help equip people to be ready. And because of a special matching challenge, your gift here in June will have double the impact. You can be part of some amazing transformations, and it all starts with a simple phone call, 1-800-347-5151, or by clicking into pointofview.net. One day, you are going to make a difference. That future is now. 1-800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again in studio with us today, Noel Bouché and Mary DeMuthe. Let me come to Mary first at MaryDeMuthe.com. There are all sorts of resources, there are books, but also, do you need to be prayed for? She has a Pray Everyday podcast. She offers free prayer. I have certainly been a recipient of that. I know others have as well. And so if you go to MaryDeMuthe.com, talk about some of the resources available at the website.
Yeah, so my husband and I wrote a book called Not Marked, Finding Hope and Healing After Sexual Abuse, and that is to help those who need to be on that healing journey. It's the first step of learning my own healing journey, and then also from the perspective of someone that was not sexually abused. So my husband gave the perspective of how to come alongside someone who's been in sexual brokenness, and I think that's such a powerful thing. I had a couple come up to me at a weekend retreat, and they both hugged me. I'm like, who are these people hugging me? But they said, "You've saved our marriage." And I was like, well, I know the Lord did, but because they had both sides of the perspective in that resource, it was really, really helpful for both, victim and the one who was not victimized.
Again, I would go to your store, find some of your books. You've also done quite a lot of mentoring over the years on Christian writing. And as a matter of fact, we're going to have Donna Skell sitting here on Thursday talking about the Christian Writers Conference. We promote it every year, and you've been a speaker so many times at that. So lots of great resources. And then go to PureHOPE.net. Resources, experiences, a blog, and other things, a video, all sorts of resources available there as well. Noel?
Yeah, lots of, again, for parents, if you're parenting right now, our Quest Parenting in a Sexualized Culture resource is for you. In fact, we developed it around the 4 questions that parents we found across the country are asking. What does the Bible actually say about sex? How do I talk to my kids about it? What do I do with the technology that's invading our homes? And how do I lead in this area if I'm not perfect myself? And that's where it walks us through in a small group setting how we answer those things and tools and strategies around it. You'll also find free resources, Recovery in a Sexualized Culture, which will point you to other great ministries like Mary's work across the country, and, of course, the Heart of Man film. You'll also find our World Free magazine. So a few years ago, we
love that magazine.
We realized that, we're not just a bunch of curriculum writers at PureHOPE. We're a bunch of artists, worship artists, writers, poets. So we wanted to take these hard topics of porn and trafficking and brokenness and exploitation and give them a soft landing in a coffee table worthy resource that through essays and poems and photo spreads really shows us the beauty of God's redemption. And it has done just that. So you'll find those resources and more at purehope.net, and I'm sure it will be a blessing for everyone who's listening.
I would suggest that if you're a doctor or a dentist and you have magazines out in your foyer, I know you've had some people do that because I've seen them there, your magazines out there, and people pick it up and go, ooh, I didn't know that was what that was all about.
We have a dentist in the Midwest who told me I've got about 10 of them in my dental office, and I gave it to a woman who just said, I'm dealing with sexual abuse in my family. I need something to give me hope.
So, again, some great resources there. Let's take some phone calls. I don't want to take too many calls because I want to hear from these 2 experts, but let's go to an individual. And, by the way, you can remain anonymous, or in this case, we've given him the name John. But, John, tell us the story that you would like to share with not only our guests but our listeners.
Yes, I got saved at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and about 4 or 5 months before I got out of service. And I had a friend that used to always witness to me a lot. And he would witness to me, and one verse that come across my mind was, what profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? So one day, we were doing drugs, all of us, acid and stuff like that. And I was sitting in my room. I'm a little nervous right now. So I was sitting in my barrack all by myself, and I was sober-minded. I knew what I was doing. I said, well, I'm going to be going home soon, and I don't want to go back to my old lifestyle. So I go to bed that night, get up the next morning. My life's completely different. I mean, God saved me. I don't know how to explain it. I couldn't wait to go to church. I bought me a new Bible, and the drinking went away, the drugs went away, the cursing went away. And about 4 or 5 days later, I started having these bad thoughts, and I was so discouraged. I said, God, I thought that went away. Why am I having this for? I mean, it just bothered me. And ever since then, I've been struggling with pornography. And I mean, that didn't go away. I've never understood that, never.
Well, that's an addiction. Noel, can you help him out? Because John, we'll call his name, is representing what I imagine there might even be hundreds of thousands of individuals listening to this program might say, well, you've just hit exactly what I'm dealing with right now.
Yeah, it's so many of our stories. And, John, I just want to thank you for your courage to share that right there. You are breaking the power of the secret in a new way, and I'm believing for breakthrough. It reminds me of a time, John, your story, where I went to a Celebrate Recovery group, and we were sharing on sexual addiction and the realities of it. And afterwards, a gentleman raised his hand, and he said, well, hello, I'm Bob. And he said, I've been a long-time alcoholic, and drug addict, and now, Noel, thanks to you, I now know sex addict today. And it was something that had not hit him yet, that he was compulsively being drawn to that. And I think John, you're not alone, and you have to realize that. And I'm going to give you a resource here in a second that's on my heart to share with you. But there's a reason why that is sometimes the last thing to go. And it's because we are male and female image bearers. We are sexual beings who are made in the image of God. And not only is that the primary place, I think, our identity as a male or female that the evil one attacks us, but it's also the deepest root, the darkness, our brokenness, wherever that came from, whether it's just mortality and sin working in us or abuse or abandonment we experience as children. That is the easiest way to cope and medicate and fill that void often is sexual activity that is unwanted in our lives. And it does become compulsive, and it becomes a part of who we are in many cases. And so, John, I'll say to you that PureHOPE.net is a great place to go. But my friend Nate Larkin is on my mind. Nate wrote a book, Samson and the Pirate Monks. It talks about his journey out of sexual addiction and how community helped him find the way and take out the personas, the masks that he was wearing to cover up really that deepest and last stronghold as he was changed. But the Samson Society has groups all over, including in Tennessee. Nate's based in Nashville. I'd encourage you to look there and go to Heart of Man movie, because my friend, my brother, if you haven't seen that movie yet, I believe it's going to work in your life and show you how the Father's pursuing you right now, even in the midst of your compulsive behavior, the addiction, the way your identity has been so wrapped around that and broken. And Mary, I think this is, one thing at Pure Hope, one of our core principles is that sex is about identity before activity. We are male and female image bearers on the first page of the Bible. Activity comes on the second page of the Bible. But what the evil one does is he uses that activity, whether that's abuse, whether that's addiction, whether that's behaviors, and it mars our identity. And that's where you've walked through in our lives. And it's a place of healing through community we get to, where we then become in a place where we can say, I actually am a beloved son or daughter of the Lord. No matter what has happened to me, no matter what's been done to me, I am this. And that's where our healing really starts.
And I just want to, I'm just going to be super vulnerable again. So this has been a really fun show, Kerby. But having grown up in a sexualized environment and having been a victim of sexual abuse, I did battle as a woman a porn addiction during my teen years, even before I met Christ, but even after. And the shame and the condemnation and I truly believe that Satan's greatest weapon against humanity is sexual brokenness. And that was my case. And I did not get set free, John, until I said it out loud, until I said it to someone I trusted. And the moment I let it out, it was like everything dissipated. Now, it still was a struggle after that for a time. And thankfully, I've walked through that and beyond it. And God's done some great healing in my heart. The other thing I would say is, I think this is also an issue of idolatry. I do believe that dopamine happens. And so it is a genuine addiction, but there's also an element of idolatry there, that we love something more than we love Jesus. And really it's about knowing how great and amazing Jesus is, which is why this movie is so helpful. We have to have a greater God, a greater one that we worship. And when we worship him and when we, revere him and we love him more than anything else, then that idolatry goes away.
Yeah. And again, I think it's a good illustration of how every other sin is apart from the body, but Jesus talks about the sin with that. And again, we now know from brain studies and hormones and endorphins and all sorts of other things how difficult it is to break any kind of sexual brokenness, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the neuroscience is clear. You mentioned the dopamine hits and how, really we see how the physical and the physiological and the spiritual are working together. The physiological becomes that place we go to fill that spiritual void because we don't believe when we've been hurt, or when we've had a stern or abusive father, or when we've never lived up to something or someone's expectations. We don't believe that God is any different. And that's really the message of the film and the message we're trying to get out, that what if, here's the question of the film, what if our brokenness is actually a bridge to the Father, not a barrier?
That's such a great
What if my
theme.
place of weakness, my place of vulnerability, the things that have been done to me are the actual places that he is coming into, sitting with me in, healing, speaking words of kindness, rejoicing over me besides that. And it's just very, very hard when we have, John mentioned his military background. I don't know what else went into that, but we're used to really being demanded a lot of in life. And it often starts in our families and our experiences. And God he's giving us a different message.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if nothing else, we've done a good job of promoting Heart of Man film again. And first of all, we encourage you to find out more about that. And maybe you would even like to bring together a men's retreat like you just talked about. We have a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. A recent article out of Canada reports that ethicists are recommending that conscience laws be modified for the medical profession. The argument suggests that physicians should not have the right to opt out of providing such services as prescribing contraceptives when a patient requests such services. According to the authors, quote, doctors must put patients' interest ahead of their own integrity. If this leads to feelings of guilty remorse or them dropping out of the profession, so be it, unquote. That is truly shocking language that we should take note of, especially since, as the article in the National Post points out, every country in the civilized world recognizes at least some form of conscientious objection. Not only do the authors suggest that certain professions should be closed to those whose integrity would require the abandonment of the conscience to practice it, it fails to understand what conscience actually is. The reason we provide protections for the exercise of conscience is because people should not be made by the government to make their conscience optional. As Dr. Robert George of Princeton University has put it, quote, the right of conscience is a right to do what one judges oneself to be under an obligation to do, unquote. We will see whether Canada takes up the proposal by its professors, but south of the border, we must be vigilant that we never permit the government to make optional what our Creator has made obligatory. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention again that we have links both to Noel Bouché and Mary DeMuthe, and I know some of you would like to talk to them, and I probably won't provide much time on air to do that, but off air, that's certainly a possibility. But not only would you like to talk to them, I know that CNN wanted to talk to you and a variety of others. So you've certainly been in the news, and talk about that, because anybody that has been following you, and I've been a follower for you for years, knows that you surfaced some issues that surfaced in the Southern Baptist Convention and then provided a context to really address this issue. And I would like people that are in positions of authority right now, that's a pastor, a Sunday school leader, a small group leader, to kind of pay attention to what you'd like to share.
Yeah, so that kind of came out of the hashtag church too. Someone was like, let's talk about the abuse in the church. And that evolved over the past several months. And then all of the things that came out with Paige Patterson and with the SBC convention and all of that. And so a group of us were out front. I don't like the word protest. It was more like a rally, which sounds much better. But the heart of all of that is not punitive. The heart, at least in me, has been education. We were longing to see a database of sexual abusers so that they've been going from church to church. They just change their geography and then they continue to abuse. And that is unconscionable. It should not happen. And just bringing more awareness of victims' voices. But I guess what I would like to say is this is a watershed movement for the church. We have a revolving back door, and even the Southern Baptists are seeing a decline in membership. And I truly believe that this issue is why, is people are going into church. They're not seeing anyone tell stories of the things that they actually go through, and they feel alone, and they walk out the back thinking that they're the only person like that. And we need to not only address it head on from the pulpit, but when someone comes into our office and says, this happened to me by the youth pastor or my friend or whatever, that pastors and people in authority take heed. And if it's a child, to report that mandatorily to the appropriate authorities and let the legal, that situation take its course because they're best able to handle it according to Romans 13. And we need to take it seriously. This will ruin the church as it did the Catholic Church. This will ruin the Protestant church if we do not just stand up and say, yes, it happened. Yes, we haven't been very great at it. Yes, we want to do better. And no, we're not going to tolerate it anymore.
And again, that's one of the reasons we did this issue on the Me Too movement, how to think about it from a Christian point of view. We have a section in there with June Hunt speaking to this issue, sexual abuse, sexual harassment, and just a duty to report. I mean, it isn't one of those, well, I'll just sit on this for a while kind of situation that I think some of the churches don't realize the gravity of the circumstances. So I want to thank you and applaud you for bringing that to the fore. Mm-hmm. Noel, that's just a good example of why we need to educate people in positions of leadership to do the right thing.
Yeah, there are legal requirements as a mandated reporter, but there are also spiritual ones as shepherds. And I think what in Mary's brave testimony, how it's hitting me is we need to listen with empathy, and that's something I've been growing in personally. I'll just go here. I've been thinking a lot about privilege lately, and I am a white male American. I was a firstborn, happened to have been an athlete and a coach's kid, and then going to law school. I've learned that a lot of places that I need Jesus to remake me is in the places of ignoring that privilege and what it means. Because legally, here's an interesting thing. Legally, a privilege doesn't mean you necessarily have been given something, like given a silver spoon or whatever. It means you don't have to attend to certain questions or issues. And as a man, in certain ways, I don't have to attend to the issues that lie behind the Me Too movement. And the pervasiveness of sexual assault and objectification of women in our society. And as the husband of an incredibly talented wife and young daughters, it has, I think, the Lord's used that to bring me to a place where I need to listen and have empathy. And we're not doing that in the church as well as we ought. And I think that leads us to another failing, which is we're not forming true relationships that are authentic. Pure hope is rooted in Scripture, and it comes from 1 John 3:3, which says that all those who hope in Jesus purify themselves as He is pure. Literally, He is our pure hope. And one thing we can take out of that verse is that purity is about relationship, not accomplishment. It's about relationship with the pure one. He is making me pure. There's really nothing I can do to keep myself pure or make myself pure. But in the church, we have this approach that still makes it feel very accomplishment-oriented. And I think that's why the revolving back door. Because if we're not naming it, if we're not speaking into it, and truly listening with empathy to model, to love one another the way Jesus said in the high priestly prayer that we ought to, we're going to see people leaving because they're not hearing, they're not seeing, and they're being marginalized. And the shame is increasing. And, we mentioned the cultural moment we're in. There's other people who are talking about it. So the church is going to lose them to other conversations happening outside the body of believers where they will be affirmed. And I think that's something we have to think about as followers of Jesus.
Mary, we've talked about this before. A church is always a day late and a dollar short, or maybe a decade late and $1 million short. So it's about time we do spend some time talking about these issues and addressing these issues inside the church so that people come to that and say, okay, you are a fellow broken individual needing help and looking for answers, and you're addressing those issues.
Exactly. And I think this is a thing I've learned throughout the years is we are injured in negative community, but God calls us to be healed in good community. And a lot of times people are finding their good community outside of the church. And that's why we do need to empathize and listen and ask questions and weep with those who weep. And we just don't do that very often. And I would love to see kind of a groundswell of revival in being actually real with one another, carrying one another's burdens, and thus fulfilling the law of Christ. That's what we're called to do, so let's do it.
Let's, if we can, since we're just about out of time, I could go on for hours with this, as you know, but let's talk about your website again, MaryDeMuthe.com. First of all, if you were asking for prayer, that is a great opportunity. If you say, I'd like to read some of your books or some of the help, or I'd like to maybe tell my story off air, they could do that with you, can't they?
They sure can. And yeah, that show is called PrayEveryday.show, and I pray 365 days a year for people, and it's all based on Scripture. So I read a Scripture, and it's all in order. Right now we're going through the Sermon on the Mount, and then I pray for you. And there have been some people who have emailed me and say, you're the only person praying for me. And I don't believe that's true. I think people are praying for each other, but it is a place to go if you need prayer.
You know, I enjoy watching you pray, you know, because you'll do that as well.
I love to pray.
So that is really so well done. And then PureHOPE.net, some great resources. We've talked about the movie, of course, which in Heart of Man is just a great resource, but also some of the curriculum. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, if you go to our website at PureHOPE.net, the first thing you'll see is what you mentioned earlier, our Live in the Loop campaign. And the loop for us is a diagram of what we think is the pure life. You know, I grew up being told in the church that purity was accomplishment. It was staying away from certain things. Keep yourself pure. We've learned that a pure life is rooted in the work of the cross, in relationship with Jesus, but it's identified by 4 attributes: prayer, understanding, resolve, and engagement in community, P-U-R-E. That's the pure life. It's proactive, and we can no longer live silently or try to keep ourselves or our children in a bubble. We have to be equipping the saints to live in a very sexually exploitative digital age. And that's what you find at Pure Hope. You'll find many resources. Our Quest Parenting in a Sexualized Culture resource and conference experience is really a place we're doubling down, because the longer we do it, the more we recognize how every church needs to walk through it. It will transform the culture of your families and hence your church, and will free lives. And boy, I tell you, the film dovetails right with that. One story about that, I have a friend who was in the shower the day after watching it, in the shower, and realized after seeing the film, I was sexually abused as a child. Never knew it. Wasn't even hiding from it, but his brokenness and his acting out and his addictions were rooted in something that had been so repressed. So you'll find things that will bring freedom, and just thankful that your listeners are here today, because this is a divine moment.
Yes. PureHOPE.net and MaryDeMuthe.com. And I wish we had more time, but we don't. So again, you can find all of that at our website, PointOfView.net. And if you want to click on that button that says donate, you can help us out as well. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. If you find yourself wanting to know a little bit more, we've given you the link. Take the time to find out. Tomorrow is our Millennial Roundtable right here on Point of View.
Ronnie fixes cars in a shop on his property. That allows him to earn a living for his family and be home to help care for Michael. Ronnie and Judy adopted Michael more than 20 years ago, knowing he would never walk or be able to care for himself. But through listening to Point of View, they were convicted that every life God gives is precious. So even though Ronnie is now 69 and Judy can't lift Michael anymore, every day is a labor of love and a testimony to their faith. Providing for their family isn't easy, and yet every month for almost 15 years, they've invested in Point of View. Some listeners have changed their communities and the nation. Ronnie and Judy changed everything for Michael. Your gift to Point of View in June is an investment in changed lives, and a matching challenge provides double the impact if you give in the next few days. Please give now, 1-800-347-5151, or visit pointofview.net. Make a difference for the future. That future is now. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.